Hey, what's up everybody? I'd like to welcome you to another JUCE tutorial. And in this tutorial, we're going to talk a little bit about change broadcasters and change listeners. So this is a way that we're able to signal to another part of our audio app that we want a change to happen when we initiate the change from a different part of the app. So one example that we commonly do this is using the timer class when we want to repaint graphics. So if we have a audio application or an audio plugin, we may have a couple components that have various graphical elements that are happening with them. And what we do is we use the timer class to signal to each one of these components that we want the graphics to refresh at a regular rate. But what if we had a situation where we only wanted that change to happen one time rather than multiple times? You would be able to use that with the timer class, but it would involve some complicated logic and Boolean flags and things like that. But there is an easier way that we can do this, and this is using the change broadcaster and change listener class. So before we get started, just wanted to remind you about our audio programming community on Discord. We now have over 8,000 members, and it's a great place to connect with audio developers of all different levels. So if you're just getting started in audio software development or curious about audio software development, you can get started. And we also have many professionals that are also in the audio programmer community, people who work for some of the biggest audio companies in the world. And you can join us on theaudioprogrammer.com/community. And also just wanted to let you know that if you found this tutorial helpful, please like and subscribe. So without further delay, let's get started. So here we are in our project, and what I've done is I've set up a template project because I think there are a lot of parts of this that I could explain from scratch, but would be redundant because I've already covered them in previous tutorials. So I have a regular plugin set up, and I have two component classes that I've set up. So these are two graphic components that I've set up. They're very basic, and as you saw before, what I have is one component here at the top in black that is what I would call a broadcaster component, and then I have another component that is sitting here in the bottom that's called a listener component, and within this listener component I have a button that's called the receiver. I just called this receiver button. Now the idea is that I want to click in the broadcaster component and I want it to trigger in the receiver component. Now, this sounds like something that would be very easy to do, but it actually involves a little bit of logic. And luckily JUCE has a couple tools that we can use in a couple classes to actually be able to do this. So what we're going to do is we're going to make this broadcaster what's called a change broadcaster, which means that it's going to signal changes to other components. And this can be to either one component or this could be to many components at once. Some components doesn't necessarily need to be to all the components. You can register certain components but leave certain ones out if you want to. In this case, we're just going to do a very simple one-to-one situation where we're going to click in the broadcaster and it's going to cause the button in the receiver to act like it's being clicked. Okay, so first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to the JUCE API. So this is where I always go when I want to figure out how to use a class. So this particular one is a change broadcaster class reference. So this is what we're going to use for our change broadcaster. And in here, it seems pretty simple. There are only a couple functions here, and the main ones that we're going to look at are add change listener and remove change listener. And for now, what we're going to do is we are just going to actually set up the class as a actual broadcaster, and it's pretty simple. So here we have a class. It's called broadcaster component, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to inherit the change broadcaster class, and I do that by saying public JUCE change broadcaster. Okay, so now this is a change broadcaster. Okay, now what I could do is I can actually do the same thing for the change listener. So I'm just going to open this up in a separate tab here. So here we have the change listener class reference. Once again, a pretty small class, but you'll see here that we have this virtual function. We can see that it's a pure virtual function because it has this equals 0 at the end. And all this means is that in order to use this class, we actually have to invoke the change listener callback. Okay, and what this means is that when something happens from the broadcaster, so in this case a mouse click, we actually need to tell the listener what we want it to do, which in this case is initiate a trigger click in that button, right? So where are we going to do that? We need to do that in the change listener callback. Okay, so that's why we need to invoke this function, this pure virtual function. Okay, so the way that we do that is we go into our listener class, and here's our listener component. Once again, we're just going to inherit public JUCE change listener. Okay, so this is now a listening class. We haven't told it that we want to necessarily listen to this particular change broadcaster. Okay, we're going to do that in just a moment. So we've now inherited change listener, and you will see that if I try to compile the plugin right now, that we will get a build failed. Okay, and then if we look at this error, and I'm going to go through this because I think that this is a good learning lesson for people who are just getting started. We can see here that there is an error that says unimplemented pure virtual method change listener callback. Okay, so that's just saying what I was telling you earlier, which is that anytime that we're looking at a C++ API and it has this equals 0, that means that we need to implement this this function whenever we inherit this class. So I'm just going to copy that like this, and I'm going to paste it down here. So it's a void function. And then I'm going to use the override keyword, and this signals to people who are reading this code that we are actually overriding a function that is being used by the one of the classes that we've inherited. Okay, and now we see it says unknown type name change broadcaster, and the reason is because we're choosing to use the JUCE namespace, okay, which I think is a good way, a good practice to use rather than just using namespace JUCE. And I've explained this in previous videos, so that's why I'm using JUCE change broadcaster there. Okay, and now what I need to do is actually create the function in my CPP file. So here I go to my listener CPP, and I'm just going to create that function here, void, and we are talking about the change listener callback function that is residing in our listener component class. Okay, so that's why we need to have that namespace listener component. Okay, so now we should be able to build, and this should work fine. Okay, so we're building, and we got build succeeded. So here we are. We still haven't really defined what we need to do here, this logic, but we've put some of the most important scaffolding in place. So the next thing that we want to do is, while we're here in listener component, we can now say what we want to happen to this button. Okay, so one of the nice things about the text button class, so this receiver button is part of the JUCE text button class, is that there's a function that's called trigger click, which actually causes a click in the button when we want to. So here I can say receiver button trigger click, and it says causes the button to act as if it's been clicked. Okay, so we're putting that within the change listener callback, because what's happening is when we're finished with this, we once again want to click on the broadcaster component, and that will cause a click to happen or act as if it's happened in this receiver button. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to register the listener component as a listener to the broadcast component. And there are two ways that you can do this in this situation. So one way would be to route the listener component directly into the broadcaster component. Okay, so it would involve listing the listener component as an argument to the broadcaster component, and then registering it within the class itself. A second way, and a preferred way that I prefer to do it, is to actually handle this in a place where there's both the broadcaster and the listener. Okay, so I'm going to show you the more complicated way first, because I think that it's a good learning lesson, and it's good for beginners to understand how data is routed from one place to another. And then I will show you the more simple way. Okay, so the way that we do it using this first way is that we need to actually we actually need to route this listener in as a reference to this listener component and add it as a listener. So this is how we're going to do this. So in my constructor for the broadcaster component, I can say JUCE change listener, and we're going to make this a reference. So that means that we're not going to do a copy of this component. It's just a reference to it. And I'm going to list that like this, and you'll see why I've done this in just a moment. So here we go. So now I need to do the same thing in my CPP file. And now what I can do is I can actually say there's a function. Actually, let me go back to the API. So we want to go back to change broadcaster. And we have this function that's called add change listener. Okay, so what I could do is, since this component is now a change broadcaster, I can just call that function directly, add change listener. And in here, I just put whatever change listener I pass into it. Okay, so now we see that we're getting a error here, and it says no viable conversion from change listener, which is an object, to a JUCE change listener pointer. Okay, and the way that you do this is it's asking for the memory address of this change listener, and the way that we could do this is by using the ampersand before the object. Okay, and that returns the memory address of the change listener. Okay, and now that clears that error up. Okay, so that's fine. And then what we need to do is, where we've actually initialized this broadcaster component in our plugin editor. So we have this plugin editor broadcast, and in here I have the broadcaster component. If I try to build right now, we're going to see that we're going to get an error, because it's going to say, hold on, it's going to say that the constructor for the broadcast listener and broadcaster audio processor editor must explicitly initialize the member broadcaster component, which does not have a default constructor. Okay, so that sounds like a very complicated and wordy way of saying, hold on, you have this broadcaster component constructor, and here you've said that you want to pass in the change listener as an argument. But when you've actually called this when you've actually created a broadcaster element, a broadcaster component, you haven't actually passed in the listener as an argument. Okay, so that's what we can do here. And the way that we would do this is we could do this using an initializer list. And what I'll do is I will just do a comma here, and I will say broadcaster component. And as you can see here, it wants a change listener. And what do you think I want to put in for the change listener, right? I want to put the listener component because that listener component is my change listener, right? So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to put listener component. This is actually the easier way. So I've made a mistake here. This is the easier way of doing this. No, I'm sorry. This is actually the hard way. So now I've got a warning here. It says audio processor will be initialized after the field right? So the reason that this warning is happening is because we have a reference to our audio processor that we have listed after broadcaster component and listener component. But here, what's happening is I've changed the order of this, okay? And it looks like audio processor is actually being initialized before broadcaster component. And that's not what we want here, okay? So we want to actually keep the order of these the same. And that's actually really important because the order that these are initialized is extremely important because I need to ensure that listener component actually exists before I pass it into broadcaster component, which means that I should actually list this beforehand. Okay, so we need to ensure that listener component actually exists before we try to pass it in to the broadcaster component. Okay, so now we see we're not getting any errors, any warnings or anything. And if I compile, this should compile now. So there we go. Now we're back and everything is fine. Okay, so now what we need to do is we've passed this in. We've passed in this listener component, and then in our broadcaster component, we've passed this listener into our broadcaster component, and we've added it as a change listener, which means that any changes that are happening in the broadcaster will register to this listener that I've registered. Okay, so now what we need is we need a way to actually signal to this broadcaster component that we're clicking on this component, right? So we don't have any way when we're clicking on this component, it's not doing anything. All right. So the way that we do this is if we go back to the component class, which is what this broadcaster component is, right? So we see that it's broadcaster component and it's inheriting the JUCE component class, which is basically saying that a broadcaster component has all the qualities and you can use all the functions of a JUCE component. So there's a handy virtual function called mouse down, okay, that we can invoke. So we can see here that it doesn't have an equals 0 here, so it doesn't mean that it's a pure virtual function. We don't have to call it if we don't want to, but in this case it's handy for us to be able to use this function because we basically are saying, okay, we want something to happen when we click the mouse down on this component. Okay, so that's the reason why I'm actually intentionally calling this function or intentionally declaring this function. So the way that I do it is like that. Once again, I'm choosing to use the JUCE namespace. It makes things a little bit more verbose, but I find that it actually keeps us from having any intentional what we call name collisions. And once again, I'm using the override keyword, and this is showing any people who are reading this code that we are inheriting a function from one of these classes that we've inherited from. Okay, so Now I just need to say what I want to happen. Okay, so now I'm going to go down here. I'm going to actually create this function. Okay, and just to start out, let's just actually do a console out, just to make sure that this actually works before we do anything else. So we're going to, we're just going to ensure that when we actually click the mouse, that it's going to, it should show the message I've been clicked here in the console here at the bottom. And we can see that that works just fine. Okay, so that works now. Since this is a change broadcaster, now I could go back to my change broadcaster class. The way that you actually show that that a message has been sent, or show that a change has been made in your change broadcaster, you can call this function called send change message. Okay, so what this does is this sends a change message to any listeners that you want to listen for a change in this particular component. So in this case, I've listed listener component as a listener for this mouse down event, and saying when I put the mouse down on here, I want to send a change message to anybody who's listening to this component. Okay, so now I believe this should work. Okay, so when I click on here, we see that now the receiver is acting like it's being clicked. So this works now. Okay, so that's really nice. As I said, I'm going to show you an easier way to set this up. Okay, so one little wrinkle that I should emphasize here is that there's one more thing that you need to do in order to use this class correctly, which is that if this broadcaster component is destroyed, you need to remove the listener as you need to remove your listening component as a listener for this broadcast component. Okay, so the way that we would do this, and you're going to see that we're going to run into a little bit of a situation here, because here what we've done is we've passed in the change listener directly into our constructor. We've added the change listener, but now we have no way that we can actually call this in our destructor, right? So that's a problem. So what we need to do is just add a little bit more data, which is that we need to actually create a reference, which would be like this. So we could say JUCE change listener, and it's important that this is a reference. Okay, we don't want to make a copy of it, we just want to point to the listener. So I'm just going to call this listener, like so. And now I've done that, and what I need to do is I need to now point this listener reference to the one that I've just passed into my constructor. And the way that I do this is like this. Okay, so now I'm saying that listener points to whatever I've passed in here. Okay, and now instead of L, I can say listener. And now because it's now a class member, I can now use it here. Okay, and now that should work fine. Okay, once again, this needs to be a pointer to listener. Since listener is a reference, I need to use the ampersand to give back the memory address of listener. So now this should build fine. And you're not really going to notice any differences in the way this functions, but there it is. It still works. Okay. So we can see that that's a little bit complicated, right? So the way that I actually like to manage these is in the parent editor. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this reference. I'm going to get rid of this as a constructor argument, and I'm going to get rid of this of adding this as a change listener and removing change listener here directly in the class. Okay, so now I can get rid of this reference here, and I can actually get rid of this this constructor and destructor directly, right? Because there's nothing actually happening explicitly in these. So I think I should be able to actually get rid of those. That cleans it up nicely. And now what I could do is I can actually, and because broadcaster component was calling, needed a reference to the listener component, I could get, and that's not happening anymore. I can get rid of that. That cleans it up nicely. And I can actually do this directly in the editor class. So since the broadcaster component has been initialized here in the class, what I could do is I could say broadcaster component add change listener, and then I could say listener and just add it directly here without needing to pass it through as a argument in the constructor. Once again, I need to do the ampersand because it needs a pointer to that. And then here in the destructor, what I could do is I could call broadcaster component, remove, and there's this nice little function here called remove all change listeners. Okay, so I can just call that there, and now we've cleaned up any mess that we've made. There are no listener components listening for broadcasters that may not exist. Okay, which can cause problems, and we can see that that works just fine. Okay, so this is a way, once again, that we can cause things if we need something to happen one time. When we initiate an action within a component and we need it to reflect in another component, we can do this using the change broadcaster and change listener classes. And this is a much cleaner way than using really complicated Boolean flags and the timer class. Okay, so this is a much cleaner alternative to doing that. I hope you found this tutorial useful. I know this was a little bit more complex than some of the other ones that I've done. If you have easier ways that you feel that this could be done and you're an experienced developer, please feel free to suggest improvements in the comments below. And if you have questions, please feel free to ask them as well in the comments below. And I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll see you next time.